Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to start by just saying a few words about what we mean about preventing the transmission of infection. So our goal here through the use of either PPE or design of our facilities is to prevent transmission from one person to another person. Now we know transmission can happen in only three ways: contact, droplet, and airborne. So everything we're doing in the design of our PPE, the use of our PPE, and the facility design and workflows is about preventing transmission. There was a prior panel on telehealth. That's an infection prevention tool. There's no interaction between the patient or providers, and therefore there's no possibility of transmitting infection. There's been a lot of talk over COVID the last 3 months about personal protective equipment. It's a household name, so we're going to dig into it first, starting about innovation in PPE, and then we'll get into the design of our facilities, our patient rooms, our hallways, the surfaces that we use. And we have a terrific all-star panel to go through this, and without further ado, we'll start. First question: personal protective equipment. Much disruption in the supply chain. We have been working on using things that have been traditionally single use, extending their use and reusing them. So I'll start with Gary Tearney, and I'll ask you, you have been in the center of this, developing ways that we can reuse and extend use many of our products, including N95s. But looking ahead, do you think we can design new sorts of PPE, new materials, new ways of using them that could actually be truly innovative and help us prevent the transmission of infection?
Yes, I really do. Starting with what the work we've been doing at the MGB Center for COVID Innovation, one thing that's really intrigued me is the concept of 3D scanning people's faces and customizing 3D printed N95 respirator analogs. I think that's a really exciting and near-term possibility for a replacement or alternative N95s. Moving forward, though, I think that it's possible that we really think beyond just the simple filtration capacity, and we can design things that maybe have nanotechnology that prevent organic material from leaving the patient's face area or from coming in, not just a simple filtration functionality. We can also think about respirators types that can become decontaminated or can become decontaminated on the spot by the press of a button. So looking forward, I think that we can really rethink how we look at respirators, how we look at preventing virus particles from entering the patient or caregiver. And we can use a lot of these innovative technologies, so hopefully we're much better off the next time we have a pandemic.
So one of the reasons we had to be so innovative this time around is because of the supply chain that was disrupted in many ways. So I'd like to turn to Michele and ask you to comment a little bit about whether we need to think about the supply chain differently, the integrity of the supply chain.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Erica, and thanks for having me. I think when we talk about innovation, whether it's innovation around products or the supply chain, it really does take a collaborative effort, which I think is just the theme of this whole conference, which is great. But what we have to consider is really there's kind of a spectrum of cost to reliability or security of the supply chain. And what we all have to reflect on is, how do we want to optimize that balance? Right now, we've optimized to a large extent towards lower cost in the supply chain so that we can use those dollars to invest in other ways that we treat patients throughout the system. So the question for us is going to be, as a society, as a country, and frankly, as a healthcare system collectively, how do we value that security or reliability or availability of supply versus the cost side? And that's true when you think about those exciting innovations that Gary talked about around products, but also when we think about just the availability and the inventory of how we treat our supply.
Michele, maybe a follow-on question to that, which is about diverting supply chain from traditional manufacturers to manufacturers who may not have, for example, been in the business of producing gowns or surgical masks. Can you comment a little bit about maybe flexibility in the supply chain?
Yeah, we have seen some of that. Even today, even just in the last few months, our company and others have been partnering with those who are not traditional makers of PPE, who've been really interested and wanted to support the effort that we're all trying to do to help do what we can to support the pandemic fight. So what we are seeing is sharing some of the designs, whether that's masks or shields, whether that's different kinds of gowns, with some of these makers, which are not traditionally approved makers. What that's been great for, I think, is some of the lower levels of Amy gowns and protection in terms of facial shields and so on. It's challenging, though, to really bring that to bear for some of the higher level of protection in the gowns, in part because that uses a different kind of raw material, which is itself under some shortage because it's needed both for the mask, the N95 mask, and the gowns. So it is a complex supply chain to sort out, but we are excited that certainly for some of those gowns, we have been able to bring some new folks into the supply chain.
Thank you. So Shelly Anderson, I'll turn to you next, and really thinking about the incident command perspective. So in the hospital setting, we set up the incident command to deal with emergencies, and you've been there in the hot seat in incident command at Brigham Health. Tell us a little bit about the major challenges over the past 3 months in terms of the supply chain, in terms of accessing PPE, and what we've learned from this experience.
So right now, as we all are experiencing, as we come down from the surge, we're in the recovery and reimagine phase. And really our priorities right now, and as most healthcare organizations are, it's threefold. First and foremost, we need to figure out how to establish our new normal for our safe care promise to our patients and families and our employees. Secondly, we really need to focus on our surveillance so that we understand and can be proactive in understanding where there's potentially hotspots or new surges of infection. And third, we're really focused right now on thinking about the flexibility of our operations as we move forward with a lot of uncertainty. And to your question about what we've learned in the last 3 months, I think the one thing that we've learned very quickly, and we've gained a lot of new muscle, is we've learned how to be very effective with data and trying to manage and monitor on a very daily basis what is going on in the operation. We're figuring out very quickly how to inform and train our employees and our patients, whether that be through attestation or through masking. We're figuring out how to change our facilities very quickly to ensure all the distancing and the cleaning measures that we need to take place. So overall, I think we've learned a lot. We've gained new muscle, and we're learning a lot very quickly, and we're applying that as we go forward into this next phase of recovery, and then looking forward to say, what should we reimagine in this new normal that we're living in?
Thank you. Before we turn back to the second half, which is going to be about the physical space and the design of our physical space, I want to come back to one of the processes that Gary mentioned, which is the decontamination of the N95s. So this was brought on because of the N95 shortage as a way to extend our supply, but eventually the supply will be restored. And so I wonder, Gary, if you could talk about whether you think a strategy and a technology that decontaminates what is essentially a single-use item in the normal or the pre-COVID normal, if that's going to have legs after this is the supply chain is restored, or if there's some future for those decontamination technologies.
Well, I think it's hard to know for sure, but I think even if the supply chain is restored, decontamination in the current crisis was a critical element of sort of maintaining the number of devices that were needed. So it's very likely that decontamination is going to become important. Also, as these technologies potentially become multiple-use devices, there's going to need to be decontamination. So I think it's an important area of technological development and investment that probably will make us better prepared for a next wave or a next pandemic.
So we're going to turn now to the physical design of where we deliver care. So as much telehealth as we have, we're going to have patients coming to us. And so I'm going to turn to Teresa Wilson, who is an architect amongst us here, to think about how do we design the physical space where care is delivered, from the way the rooms are set up, hallway set up, the surfaces that we choose, with an angle and an eye towards preventing the transmission of infections in our healthcare facilities.
Well, for the past 5 years, I've been part of a working group of architects, engineers, infection control, environmental services design people, working on just that, looking at how we can use design to reduce or minimize the hospital-associated infections within the design of an inpatient bedroom. So what we've done is we've created a set of principles that can be flexed up and down depending on if it's a room or a whole space. Some of the principles that we talked about were facilitating appropriate hand washing, looking at where PPE and hand sanitizers are, separating clean and dirty functions, and also really looking first and foremost at how can we make the room as easy to clean as possible and and easy to maintain. A lot of that is the discussions we have early on with the group, really understanding how a room is cleaned, how long it takes to clean, and then going over with the team, looking at the different surfaces and materials, using solid surfacing, what type of hand wash sink we use, where the sink is located in the room to get out of the splash zone. We did one hospital inpatient room, and we didn't a number of years ago, looking at mostly constructability of the room and the materials. Now we're doing a second room, and we're looking at more hands-free, voice-activated technology. How can we use modular construction to bring the walls on site already ready for plug-and-play, integrating technology, and really creating as cleanable a room as possible. And I think, as most designers would know, having this collaborative group is key at the beginning of any design process.
Thank you. So that's a really good insight into, for example, new construction or perhaps renovations. I think I want to pull back to where, Shelly, you were describing some of the lessons we learned were about doing things differently in the spaces that we had. Now, that can be require expensive investments. It can also require a lot of agility in terms of changing the function of an existing space into a different function. And maybe you could comment a little bit about one sort of lessons learned from making those conversions in the heat of the COVID outbreak, but also thinking about how do you strategically make financial investments in either renovations or new construction and design with an eye towards, as was just described, trying to make these locations sort of amplify our infection prevention, either through the choices of the surfaces, the physical layouts, or the ways that we make it easier for healthcare workers to work within these locations.
Yes, I think it's a mixture of things. Like when we think about the facility itself, there's obviously some things that we can do that's very manual and structural, whether that be, making sure that the chairs and the waiting areas are 6 feet apart, putting the partitions up so that people feel like there's a safe blockade between individuals. But there's also a lot that we're doing and we've learned related to process. There's discussions going on right now of like, how can we ensure that, patients only arrive for a clinic visit at the time that they're allotted, and potentially they wait in their car until they've been asked to arrive. So there's a lot that I think that we can do with process. And I also think there's a lot that we can do as it relates to our labor workforce and how we want to distribute that workforce in a different way from a safety perspective. We've had a lot of observation individuals that will ensure that people are practicing the correct distancing processes, as well as from a donning and doffing perspective for PPE. So I think we have to do things with labor. We have to change our process. We have to look at our structures. And some of that's the physical structures, but it's how we use our workforce in a different way as we move forward as well.
Michele, on that point, in terms of the supply chain, can you talk a little bit about investments in either new materials or other sorts of investments that you're thinking of making to either stabilize the supply chain or make the products that are coming out of the supply chain even better?
Yeah, just in terms of the supply chain itself, we've been doing a tremendous amount of work to, first of all, just look for additional suppliers. Not all suppliers who say they have qualified masks or gowns or other kinds of PPE necessarily are. You've seen some of that in the press where suppliers which were actually not providing the appropriate supplies were found. So we do a lot of work to, first of all, ensure that every supplier that we use is actually truly qualified. Second of all, we do manufacture some PPE ourselves, and we have also extended the work that we do, changed over some plans to provide more gowns and masks in terms of what we're able to supply ourselves. But then third is also thinking and ultimately working with our R&D and perhaps some of the folks that Gary talked about in terms of thinking about what are alternative raw materials that we can use and other ways that we can bring new materials in to enhance the ability to provide more supply.
So Gary, I'll turn back to you about a particular innovation that I know is in development that is kind of a cross between thinking about new construction and facility design and a little bit about PPE, which has to do with these negative pressure isolation hoods that are really meant to mitigate risk under some of the more high-risk procedures, including intubations that take place on patients. And maybe you could tell a little bit about where we are in the development of these hoods and some reflections on what it took to get to where we are today and where you see these going, and if they have a role maybe post-COVID as well.
Yeah, so these hoods are really exciting. They're essentially plastic shrouds that are placed over the patient, or pieces of plastic, and negative pressure is applied, preventing aerosolization of the virus. What's really interesting about them right now is that they provide a second line of defense to existing PPE. Which is actually really great. When people wear PPE, I think if it's done correctly and everything's going perfectly, that's fine. But to have a second line of protection is really great and increases confidence. It also increases confidence in thinking about, doing non-invasive ventilation procedures like CPAP, for example, when otherwise you might not have the confidence to do that procedure. I think moving forward, too, we can consider concepts like being able to wean people off of ventilators earlier to CPAP, and these hoods may provide an effective avenue towards doing that. As we learn more and more about these hoods, also it opens up the possibility of someday not having to wear as much PPE to do these procedures once we validate that the virus is contained within the hood itself. So I think this particular innovation has a lot of legs, is going to help us in COVID and down the road in future procedures where the environment needs to be protected from aerosolized infectious agents.
Before I turn to some closing thoughts from the panel and a very specific question to each of them, I'm going to ask Teresa to comment on transitioning spaces into surge spaces. That's been kind of a theme of COVID, where we've had to take places that normally don't do certain kinds of care and surge them. Could you comment just briefly on your work in that area?
So we've had a panel group meeting for the past 3 months or so, since March actually. So looking at different ways that spaces can accommodate surge. Obviously, we've been all hearing about conference centers. We've also talked a little bit about ambulatory surgery centers, how they can take the non-COVID patients offline. In potentially, we've seen an ASC being used as a birthing center. Looking at really understanding how we can support reducing the load of the COVID patient stress within the inpatient, and looking at how we can take that offline for post-COVID patient is something that's important also.
Terrific. Okay, so the last question, rapid fire for each of the panelists, and I'll do a little roll call, is if you had to think back to what we've learned and looking forward, what is the one specific innovation, either in PPE or facility design, that you think will make us more prepared for either a second surge or the next pandemic, dare I say it? So I'll start with Shelly. You're up first.
So I would say that the invention that I would say the innovation that came to life during this phase has really been all about the virtual care. And I would say that is not only going to stay with us and help us for whatever is to come, but if you think about the virtual visits that we've been able to do to ensure that our patients have been been able to seek their continued care, as well as what we've done in the inpatient rooms and procedural areas to ensure that's a safe environment for our employees and healthcare workers. I think that's been a fantastic advantage. It will help us as we go forward. It really helped us to surge, and it also helped us to ensure that we didn't overuse PPE during some of the early days where we were definitely in a shortage situation. The last thing I'll say too is this is not an innovation, but I think we've all learned that sometimes the just-in-time process doesn't serve us well, and we really have to think about kind of the old rules of having stockpile and other ways to have inventory on hand when we need it. I think that's been a lesson definitely learned.
Okay, Michele.
Yeah, just building off of that, I think a lot of work around the connection between data and demand and supply. So how to really tune up the demand modeling, and we're working really closely with the health systems that we work with to help think about both for this recovery phase, but also for the future, as Shelly alluded to, about how do we think about the right match between demand modeling for the future and how we keep that supply ready. So that connection is super important.
Thank you. And Gary, you're next.
Yeah, I think the two we highlighted, I think the reuse and decontamination process and also the patient isolation booths and hoods, I think have really helped in our current situation.
And Teresa, you'll close us out.
I think telehealth is a real game changer with healthcare design. I think it's going to really, we need to really look at how we design spaces, maybe fewer exam rooms, look at the acuity of patients who will be receiving in-person care. And I think you start from, as soon as you drive on the site, do you need as many parking spaces? Is your supply chain different? I think it's going to really require a lot of thought from the design community on how we adapt telehealth to patient care design.
Well, I want to thank all of our speakers today for a really terrific panel, and thanks to the organizers for having us here today.